Before he became a hero, before he captured 130 German soldiers in a single day, before the newspapers called him the greatest American soldier of World War I, Alvin York was simply a poor Tennessee farmer trying to survive the rugged hills of Appalachia. He was born in 1887 in a tiny log cabin in Pall Mall, a place so remote and unremarkable that maps barely acknowledged it. The York family lived off the land because they had no choice. 11 children, 1 mule, a few acres of stubborn soil, and not nearly enough money. Alvin's father, William York, taught his children the 2 skills he believed mattered most: how to work and how to shoot. The York boys practiced with old, battered rifles passed down through the family. They hunted for food, for sport, for survival. By the time Alvin was a teenager, he could hit a squirrel clean through the eye at 40 yards with iron sights, but he wasn't known for discipline. In his late teens and early 20s, Alvin York became what people in the mountains politely called wild. He drank heavily, got into fistfights on Saturday nights, and caused trouble in every saloon from Pall Mall to the Kentucky border. Some nights he staggered home bruised, bloody, or broke, depending on the choices he made that evening. His mother, Mary York, prayed for him constantly, and eventually, something changed. One night, one of Alvin's closest friends was killed in a bar fight. The shock shook him to his core. He stopped drinking, stopped fighting, stopped chasing trouble. He turned to religion deeply, passionately, and joined the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a denomination that preached strict pacifism. Killing was forbidden, violence was a sin, and war was the greatest evil of all. Alvin York vowed never to harm another soul. He had no idea that the greatest test of his life and his faith was coming straight toward him. In April 1917, the United States entered World War I. Posters flooded every town. "I want you for the U.S. Army." Bands played patriotic music. Young men rushed to enlist. But in the hills of Tennessee, war felt like a distant thunderstorm, loud, but not yet close. Until the draft notice arrived, Alvin York opened the letter with trembling hands. "You are hereby ordered for military service." He immediately filed for exemption on religious grounds as a conscientious objector. He wrote, "I don't want to fight with the same steady hand he used on a rifle trigger," but the board rejected his request. The government did not recognize his small mountain church. Alvin York appealed. Rejected again, a third time. Rejected. There was no escape. The government wanted him. On November 15, 1917, Alvin York boarded a train to Camp Gordon in Georgia and entered the U.S. Army. This wasn't his choice. It was his burden. From the moment he arrived in camp, the conflict inside him was heavy and painful. On one side, Scripture. On the other, duty. And between them, a man with a good heart and a tortured soul. He trained with the 82nd Division, later known as the All-American Division. Drill instructors yelled. Recruits marched. Soldiers fired rifles, dug trenches, and crawled under barbed wire. Alvin did it all, quietly, obediently, but he refused to see himself as a killer. Then something unexpected happened. His officers noticed his shooting ability. During marksmanship tests, York performed flawlessly. He hit every target, every distance, every challenge thrown at him. Time after time, the instructors watched in disbelief as the tall, soft-spoken Tennessean hit bullseyes others couldn't even attempt. Lieutenant George Edward Buxton, one of his commanders, studied York closely. "You're one of the best shots I've ever seen," he told him. "Why not use that talent for your country?" York shook his head. "My Bible tells me not to kill." Captain Danforth, another officer, sat with him for hours, discussing scripture, history, and duty. He wasn't trying to force York. He was trying to help him understand the moral weight of war. One night, York went to the hills alone with his Bible. He prayed. He cried. He wrestled with the deepest conflict he had ever known. At dawn, he returned to camp with a quiet determination. "I'm going to serve," he said softly, He didn't claim he understood everything. He didn't pretend he wanted war. But he believed in his heart that sometimes a man must stand against evil. In May 1918, Alvin York and the men of the 82nd Division sailed for Europe. The journey across the Atlantic was long and tense. German U-boats prowled beneath the waves, waiting to strike. Soldiers slept in crowded bunks, played cards, wrote letters home, and wondered if they would ever return. York spent his evenings reading scripture, watching the sea, thinking of home. France greeted them with mud, smoke, and the distant rumble of artillery. The war was no longer a story in newspapers. It was the earth shaking beneath their boots. It was the smell of cordite and burning wood. It was wounded men being carried away on stretchers. York breathed it in. He listened to it, and he prepared himself for whatever lay ahead. The first major battle for York and the 82nd Division was the St. Mihiel Offensive in September 1918. The first operation conducted entirely by the United States Army. York's unit advanced through trenches that looked like scars torn across the earth. The ground was soaked with rain and blood. Trees were shattered stumps. Barbed wire stretched across the landscape like metal spiderwebs. He saw men fall. He heard shells scream overhead. He felt the shockwaves rattle his bones. York fired his rifle only when absolutely necessary. He aimed carefully. He refused to take a life unless there was no other choice. Under fire, he remained calm and steady, a quiet man in a storm of chaos. But St. Mihiel was only a warm dash up. The real test, the moment that would carve his name into military history, was still to come, and it came in the form of a place the Germans called the Forest of Death. October 1918, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest operation in American military history. The mission was simple to write on paper and nearly impossible to carry out. Break through German lines, cut supply routes, force the Kaiser's army to retreat. Simple, impossible, and deadly. The Argonne forest was thick, dark, and suffocating. Fog rolled through the trees. Machine guns waited behind every ridge. German snipers watched from nests hidden in branches. Entire regiments vanished into the woods and came out as shadows, if they came out at all. York's unit, Company G, 328th Infantry, received orders to push forward, take German positions, and break a heavily fortified line near the village of Chatelchahi. It was the kind of mission that swallowed men whole. At dawn on October 8, 1918, York tightened the straps on his gear, checked his rifle, whispered a quiet prayer, and followed his company into the dark forest. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary moments in American military history, and it began with disaster. As Company G advanced through the woods, German machine guns opened fire from hidden bunkers on a ridge. Bullets tore through branches, kicked up dirt, and cut down soldiers before they could hit the ground. Men shouted. Officers called orders, lost in the noise. The forest exploded with sound. York and 16 other men were ordered to flank the machine gun nests and silence them. They slipped into the trees, moving fast, hoping to swing around behind the German positions. But instead of outflanking the enemy, they walked straight into another unit of German riflemen lying in wait. In moments, the Americans were surrounded. German soldiers shouted. Rifles were raised. Machine guns pivoted toward them. Many of York's fellow soldiers were killed instantly. Others fell wounded. Only a handful remained standing. The mission was collapsing. The men were trapped, and the German machine guns were still firing on the American main line. One man now stood between life and death for dozens, maybe hundreds, of American soldiers, Alvin York. He alone remained untouched. He alone had a clear line of sight. He alone carried the calm, deadly precision of a mountain marksman. He knelt behind a small rise of earth, breathed in slowly, and prepared to do the unthinkable. His moment had come. The forest swallowed the sound of the sergeant's fall. For a moment, nothing moved, nothing breathed. The German machine guns kept tearing into the clearing, unaware of the shift that had just occurred, or perhaps aware, and eager to finish what they had started. The remaining American soldiers, frightened, pinned, leaderless, looked to the only man still fully exposed to fire. Alvin York, not because he wanted command, not because he had asked for it, but because no one else dared to move. York pressed himself into the mud, feeling the thump of bullets cutting the air above his back. The men beside him shouted, some in fear, some in pain, some in rage. York felt none of it. His mind quieted, his heartbeat slowed, and a strange, steady focus fell over him. In Tennessee, he had hunted to feed his family, turkeys, rabbits, deer. He was used to targets that moved, that listened, that hid behind cover. These machine gunners? They were loud, careless, exposed. York whispered to himself, Lord, help me do what I must. Then he rose, not fully, just enough so that he could see the shape of the first machine gun nest between the brush and smoke. The German gunner fired in long, furious bursts, the muzzle glowing under the forest gloom. York inhaled, let out half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. One shot. The gunner collapsed, the machine gun sputtered, coughed, and fell silent, but the others kept firing. York shifted positions, crawling with the quiet of a hunter closing in on prey. Bullets ripped through leaves inches from his head, but he did not flinch. His rifle cracked again. Another gunner dropped. The forest was no longer a battlefield, it was a hunting ground. And York was the only hunter who knew how to move. Two German soldiers charged him with bayonets fixed. York calmly aimed and fired. The first fell. He reloaded before the second reached him, and dropped that one to behind him. His men watched in disbelief. A few whispered, he's doing it. He's taken 'em all out, but York barely heard them. The world had narrowed into rhythm, aim, breathe, fire, reload. He pressed forward until he was within 30 yards of one of the largest machine gun nests. German voices shouted frantically, orders, panic, disbelief. York stood up in full view of the enemy, raised his rifle, and shot the officer giving commands. The nest fell apart instantly. Panic spread through their ranks like a spark in dry grass. York advanced again, and suddenly found himself facing 6 German soldiers rushing him from different angles, bayonets lowered, boots pounding through the mud. York didn't panic. Instead, he remembered a scene from home, the way he used to take down a line of charging turkeys who scattered when startled. You had to shoot the closest first, the one who was most likely to get you. So he did. Bang. The nearest soldier dropped. Bang. The second collapsed before he could swing his rifle. Bang. The third fell face first into the mud. 6 came at him. 6 failed to touch him. One by one, they fell until none were left standing. Silence washed over the clearing. Then, from the far side of the trees, a different voice called out. A desperate, frightened voice. The commanding German officer, trembling, exhausted, stunned, stepped out into view waving a white cloth. Stop shooting. Stop shooting. He pleaded. We surrender. York kept his rifle up as the man approached. From behind the officer, German soldiers began rising from their dugouts, hands raised, weapons dropped. More came, and more. First dozens, then over 100. York's own men stumbled from the brush, stunned by what they were seeing. One soldier whispered, is this real? Or am I seeing a miracle? Another breathed, he did it. Lord help us. He actually did it. York looked at the sea of surrendered Germans, terrified, beaten, and confused at how one man had stopped an entire machine gun battalion. He cleared his throat. All right, boys. Line up. Keep your hands where I can see 'em. Even the German officer obeyed immediately. York started marching them back toward American lines. 132 prisoners, a single rifle, and only a handful of surviving American soldiers to guard them. When York reached the command post, the American officers froze. Good God. One whispered, you captured. How many? York shrugged. I don't rightly know. Might be 100 or so. They was yes ready to quit. I reckon the officers stared at him, part disbelief, part awe. Word of what he had done spread across the division within hours. Some called it a miracle, others called it legend. But to York, it was simply what needed to be done to save his men. He never boasted, never bragged, never claimed to be anything special. He just returned to his unit and sat quietly, cleaning the mud from his rifle. The camp buzzed like a disturbed hive. Officers hurried from tent to tent. Dispatch riders galloped through the mud, and whispered rumors spread faster than any official report could keep up with. Wherever the soldiers of the 82nd Division gathered, in mess lines, by the fires, under makeshift shelters, one name passed from mouth to mouth: York. York, York. Some said he'd charged a hill alone. Some claimed he wiped out an entire regiment. Others swore he had divine protection, that bullets swerved around him, though heaven itself guarded his steps. But Alvin York said nothing. He sat quietly, repairing a tear in his uniform sleeve, as if the last hours had been nothing more than a difficult morning hunt. When curious officers approached and pressed him to describe the action, he kept his answers short. Well, sir, my rifle worked and the Lord was with me. The officers exchanged puzzled glances. How could one man summarize a miracle in 10 words? Word of York's actions soon reached the highest ranks of the American Expeditionary Forces. General Lindsay himself arrived to interview him. The general was a tall, stern figure accustomed to discipline, exactness, and clear reports. York stood and saluted as the general entered at ease. Corporal Lindsay said, forcing formality aside, "Now tell me, how did you capture an entire battalion by yourself?" York shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I had help." Lindsay's brow lifted. "Your patrol?" "No, sir." The general stared for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "Well, I suppose every soldier says that after surviving what you did." York didn't argue. He didn't elaborate. He simply described the facts, quietly, humbly, without dramatic flourish. He spoke of the patrol being ambushed. He spoke of the fallen sergeant. He spoke of advancing alone because the others could not. He spoke of shooting only when he had to. He spoke of the German surrender, bewildered, frightened, overwhelming in number. When he finished, Lindsay remained silent for several seconds. Finally, the general said, "Corporal York, I don't know what higher power protects you, but the United States Army thanks you." York simply nodded. "I just wanted to save my boys." Sir, that single sentence traveled through headquarters like a spark on dry grass. Not everyone believed the story. Some senior officers argued that no single soldier could possibly capture 132 men armed with machine guns. Others suspected exaggeration, a battlefield tale inflated by panic and confusion. So command did the only thing they could. They interviewed the prisoners. German officers were questioned separately. Their answers were consistent, precise, and free of hesitation. One man, a tall man with a red beard, he moved like a ghost. He shot with impossible accuracy. One shot, one casualty. He killed at least 20 of our gunners before we realized we could not stop him. We surrendered to avoid slaughter. He would have killed us all. The Germans were not ashamed. They were impressed, frightened, even by the Appalachian farmer with the calm eyes and deadly rifle. Their testimonies matched York's perfectly. The debate was over. Recommendation for the Medal of Honor moved quickly up the chain of command, but not without tension. Some senior leaders wanted to delay the award until after the war, fearing the story sounded too legendary to be real. But General Pershing, commander of all American forces in Europe, read the full report and wrote only one sentence on the file: "This man deserves the highest recognition the United States can give." Congress agreed. The Medal of Honor was approved. Yet York didn't know. No one told him. Not officially. He simply returned to the 328th Infantry, preparing again for the next march, the next bombardment, the next cold night on the Meuse-Argonne line. War was still raging, And York had no interest in medals while his friends were still dying. Days later, the regiment was ordered forward again. Many assumed York would be reassigned to a safe post. A man who had done the work of an entire platoon in a single hour deserved rest, or so they thought. But when the orders came through, York's name was on the list. He didn't protest. He didn't expect special treatment. He simply packed his kit, slung his rifle, and marched with his unit toward the next sector. As they advanced through shattered valleys and smoking woods, soldiers from other divisions recognized him. Some saluted. Some touched his arm as if the gesture might bring them luck. Some stared in awe, whispering stories to each other. "You the feller who did it?" One young private asked timidly. York offered a shy smile. "I'm just a soldier, same as you." But to the men, he was not the same. He was proof that one man could stand against hell and come out alive. In early November, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive entered its most violent week. The Germans were retreating, but stubbornly, savagely, unwilling to concede ground. York fought beside his comrades through trenches half filled with water, past towns reduced to blackened stones, and across hills that changed hands 3 times in a single day. He did not seek glory. He did not repeat his earlier feat. He simply fought, quietly, steadily, with the grim determination of a man who wished the war would end before more young boys died. The men of the 82nd trusted him more than any officer. If York said a trench was safe, they followed. If York said to keep low, they obeyed without question. They knew he would never lead them into danger without reason. He was too humble for that. Too honest. On November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock a.m., the guns fell silent. York stood among his men in a muddy French field, staring across a landscape that had cost millions of lives. The silence felt unnatural, eerie, heavy. Some soldiers cheered, some wept, some simply collapsed from exhaustion. York removed his helmet and closed his eyes. "Thank God it's done," he whispered. No one around him knew he had just been approved for the Medal of Honor. No one knew the fame that awaited him. No one knew his life was about to change forever. But York felt something deep inside, a mix of relief, sorrow, and uncertain dread. He had survived. He had saved his men, and he had done it without sacrificing the faith he had nearly abandoned. Yet he feared one thing above all: the world would soon turn him into something he was not. The ship that carried Alvin York back to the United States cut through gray Atlantic waters under a winter sky. Round him, soldiers leaned on the rails, staring at the coastline with everything from relief to confusion. Many were broken in body. Others bore wounds no surgeon could see. But all longed for home. York stood among them silently. He felt the pull of Tennessee, the mountains, the creeks, the small wooden church that had once held him together when the world seemed too cruel to understand. He wanted only to return to the ridges and hills where his life made sense, but the world would not allow him to disappear so easily. As the ship docked in Hoboken, crowds swarmed the piers. Bands played, flags waved, reporters gathered like vultures. York kept his head down, but it didn't matter. Someone spotted him. There he is. That's York, the man who took 130 to Germans. Flashbulbs exploded in his face. Microphones were shoved toward him. Journalists barked questions over one another. How did you do it? Did you kill 20 men with 20 shots? Do you believe God guided your rifle? How does it feel to be America's greatest hero? York raised his hands gently. Fellows, I ain't no hero. I just did my duty. It was exactly the kind of answer reporters hungered for. The humble giant, the mountain man made of mercy and steel. The reluctant legend. By nightfall, his name was on the front page of every major newspaper in the country. From New York to Philadelphia to Washington, celebrations awaited him. Crowds lined the streets, waving flags, shouting his name. Bands played as if leading a conqueror. Children held signs that read, "Welcome home, Corporal York." But in York's eyes, the real heroes were behind him, buried in France. In graves marked by simple white crosses, He rode on the parade floats because he was asked. He smiled because the people needed hope. But his thoughts were far away, walking silently among those crosses. When a little girl ran forward from the crowd and handed him a rose, York bent down and whispered, "Give one to the boys who didn't make it home, all right?" The girl nodded, sensing something solemn in his voice. On April 18, 1919, Alvin York stood in the White House, wearing his uniform pressed neatly, his boots polished, but his posture still humble, the stance of a farmer trying not to take up too much space. President Woodrow Wilson himself stepped forward. "Corporal York," Wilson said, "you represent the finest traditions of valor, sacrifice, and service." York lowered his eyes as the Medal of Honor was placed upon his chest. A room full of generals, congressmen, foreign dignitaries, and military officials applauded, but York's hands trembled, not from pride, not from nerves, from the weight of the responsibility he felt. Afterward, the president shook his hand. "America owes you a great debt." York looked up at him, tired, soft-spoken, sincere. "No debt, sir. Just do what's right for them boys who ain't here to see this." It was a moment Wilson never forgot. For weeks afterward, newspapers printed his face everywhere. He became the symbol of American bravery, the humble man who didn't want war but fought like a lion when called upon. Hollywood producers wrote him letters. Magazine companies offered huge sums for exclusive stories. Advertising agencies begged him to endorse everything from tobacco to tractors. One company even offered him $250,000, a fortune at the time, to appear in a film about his own exploits. York refused all of it. Every penny. When asked why, he answered simply, "I won't profit from the war. That ain't why I done what I done." The press was stunned. Some admired him. Some mocked him for being naive. But York did not bend. He had seen too much death to turn it into entertainment. And deep down, he felt the eyes of heaven watching. When he finally returned to Pall Mall, Tennessee, the entire valley turned out to greet him. Old friends slapped his back. Children clung to his uniform. Neighbors shouted their praise through tears of joy. And there, waiting quietly on the porch of a simple wooden cabin, was the woman he had written letters to throughout the war, Gracie Williams. York approached her with a shy smile. "Miss Gracie," he said softly, "I made it home." She touched his hand. "Thank God you did." The next day, York walked up the mountain to the small church where he had once pleaded for guidance. The congregation rose to their feet as he entered, singing hymns of thanksgiving. When they finished, the pastor invited him to speak. York stepped forward slowly. "I thank you all for praying for me," he said, "and I thank the Lord for bringing me home. But I ain't no hero. Heroes are the ones still over there. My only hope is to do something good with the time I got left." The church fell silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. They didn't know it yet, but this quiet vow would define the rest of his life. Despite refusing fortune after fortune, one offer caught York's attention, not because of money, but because of what it could do for the people he loved. A wealthy group of New Yorkers approached him with a proposal. They wanted to raise funds in his name, using his story to improve education in the Tennessee mountains. York thought deeply on it. His people were poor. Schools were scarce. Many children had no chance for a future beyond the fields and coal mines. So finally, he said yes, not for himself, but for the valley that raised him, and thus began the largest mission of his life, to bring education, opportunity, and hope to Appalachia. But that story, his greatest battle outside the war, was still ahead. The war was over. The parades had faded, and the crowds finally drifted away. What remained was something far more important to Alvin York, the life he had dreamed of before ever setting foot on French soil. On June 7, 1919, in a small country church surrounded by rolling hills and green hollows, Alvin York married Gracie Williams. The ceremony was simple. No photographers, no reporters, just family, friends, and neighbors humming old hymns under their breath. York stood tall in his uniform. Gracie wore a plain white dress sewn by her mother. When the pastor asked York if he took Gracie as his wife, he answered softly, "With all my heart," afterward. As they walked down the church steps, old mountain men clapped him on the back while women hugged Gracie with teary smiles. Someone asked York, "How does it feel to marry the prettiest girl in the valley?" York grinned shyly. "I reckon I'm the luckiest feller God ever made." For the first time since the battlefield, he looked at peace. But York could not rest for long. He had seen the poverty of the mountains in a way he never fully understood before the war. Children worked the fields instead of going to school. Families lived in cabins barely held together by worn planks. Opportunity was something spoken of in distant towns, never in Pall Mall. York told Gracie one evening as they sat on their porch, "If the Lord saw fit to spare me in France, He must want me to do something for these hills. What do you want to do?" Gracie asked. York looked out over the valley, where the sky touched the ridges like a fading watercolor. "I want to build a school. A proper one. For every child who never had a chance." Gracie touched his arm. "Then we'll do it. Somehow. The word hung in the air. Because the truth was harsh, York had returned home with no wealth, no resources, and no way to build a school on his own. But he believed that if he walked forward, God would put the stones beneath his feet. To raise money. Prominent citizens in New York, wealthy businessmen inspired by York's humility, helped launch the Alvin York Foundation. Their goal was ambitious: create a high-quality school in the mountains of Tennessee, something that could transform entire generations. York traveled the country, giving speeches in his slow, steady voice. Education, he told crowds, is the way out of poverty. Guns won a war. Books win a future. People applauded him everywhere he went. Newspapers praised him. Donations began to trickle in. Yet something began to gnaw at him. A subtle doubt, a quiet fear. His name was being used. His story was being repeated, polished, and sold by others. And sometimes, the people promising help were not as honorable as they claimed. Still, York pushed forward. For the children. For the valley. For the promise he'd made in his heart during the darkest nights in France. Months passed. Then York realized something heartbreaking. The people who promised millions gave almost nothing. The businessmen who once admired him had moved on. The newspapers that called him a hero no longer printed his struggles. The country that cheered his return had forgotten his mission. He was alone again. Several businessmen even began using his name to raise money that never reached Tennessee. York confronted one of them. "You've been collecting funds in my name. Where are they?" The man shrugged. "Expenses, Sergeant. These things cost money." York clenched his fists. "You're stealing from my people." But there was no law he could use. No power, no influence. He was just a farmer again, fighting a battle he didn't know how to win. Determined to keep his promise, York decided to build a school anyway, even if it meant going into debt. Even if he had to use every cent from the small land grant the Tennessee government awarded him for his wartime service. He signed loans he couldn't afford. He hired workers he had no money to pay. He watched every dollar vanish into lumber, stone, and tools. By 1925, he owed thousands. Creditors knocked on his door. Letters demanding payment piled up. One banker told him harshly, "You're a war hero, Mr. York. That doesn't make you a businessman." York lowered his eyes. "I ain't trying to be a businessman. I'm just trying to help." The banker shook his head. "Good intentions don't pay debts." York walked home slowly, the weight of the valley on his shoulders. Despite the financial strain, something miraculous happened. The people of Pall Mall, farmers, blacksmiths, housewives, and coal miners, began volunteering. They brought hammers, saws, and horses. They hauled stone from the river. They cut lumber from their own land. "We'll build this school," Alvin, an old neighbor, told him. With or without those city men, York felt tears sting his eyes. But he blinked them away. "Thank you," he whispered. Little by little, The school rose from the ground, not because of wealth, but because ordinary people poured their hearts into it. Yet even as York saw the walls climb higher, the debts grew worse. He prayed each night for an answer, and then, unexpectedly, it came from the most unlikely place, Hollywood. In 1939, a car pulled up the dirt road near York's home. A man in a neat suit stepped out and tipped his hat. "Sergeant York," he asked. "My name is Jesse Lasky. I'm from Warner Brothers Studios." York's heart sank. He had refused Hollywood a dozen times. He did not want his story turned into drama or spectacle. "I ain't interested," he said, trying to shut the door. Lasky pressed his hand gently against it. "Please, hear me out. America needs inspiration. The world is drifting toward war again. Your story could matter." York hesitated, then shook his head. "I didn't fight for glory. I won't sell it now." Lasky nodded respectfully. "Then let me ask you one thing. Is it true you're trying to build a school, and that you're drowning in debt?" York stiffened. "That ain't your concern." Lasky spoke softly. "What if the film paid off your debts? What if it finished your school? What if your story could give mountain children their future and give a troubled country some hope?" York froze, feeling the weight of everything: his people, his promise, his faith. He knew Hollywood wanted his story, but maybe, just maybe, this time he could use Hollywood, not the other way around. "I'll pray on it," he finally said. Lasky nodded. "And when you're ready, Sergeant York, we'll be waiting." York closed the door and sat quietly at the table. He folded his hands. He bowed his head. For the first time since the war, he felt the Lord giving him a path forward. The German prisoners marched ahead silently, their boots sinking into the mud with soft, rhythmic thuds. The morning fog wrapped around them like a drifting shroud. York walked behind them, watchful, rifle casually balanced in his hands, as if he were escorting livestock rather than captured enemy soldiers. But his eyes were sharp, cautious. He expected treachery at any moment. Captain Danforth waited near the base of the hill, stunned by the approaching column. At first, he thought he was seeing things, ghosts or shadows. But as the prisoners came closer, his jaw dropped. "Good Lord. York, what have you done?" York shrugged in that humble Tennessee way. "Just did what I had to do, sir." The captain stared at the 30 prisoners, then 50, then 100. His eyes widened as more men appeared through the fog. "How many are there?" York answered like he was guessing the weight of a harvest. "'Bout 132, far as I can reckon." 130? Danforth stammered. "York, how did you do this?" York shifted uncomfortably. Praise made him uneasy. "The Lord was with me, sir." Danforth took a long breath, speechless. He had heard reports of lone heroes before, but never something like this, not from a man who almost refused to fight at all. That night, York sat alone near the trench line, cleaning his rifle in silence. Round him, soldiers whispered, stealing glances at him as if he were some kind of miracle. He took out a whole machine gun nest by himself. They say he shot 6 Germans, charging him 1 bullet each. He captured 130 men. York kept his head down. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt heavy. The faces of the men he had killed lingered in his mind, hovering just behind his closed eyelids. Men who had been laughing, smoking, or joking moments before he arrived. Men with families, with lives far away from this muddy hell. Skt. Early approached, placing a hand on York's shoulder. "You did what you had to do. Alvin, you saved lives today, our lives." York nodded slowly. "I know, but it don't make the killing sit any easier." Early sighed. "If it did, you wouldn't be the man who saved us." There was no glory in York's expression, only quiet, unresolved sorrow. A man who had been forced by war to do something he never wished to do, and had done it better than anyone else. When the official paperwork was written, officers struggled to find words strong enough to describe York's actions: fearless, extraordinary, single-handed. None of it seemed enough. General Lindsay read the report twice, then looked up at York. "Corporal, I've been in the army for 40 years. I have never seen anything like this." York shuffled awkwardly. "I was just trying to do my duty, sir." "No," Lindsay said firmly. "You went far beyond that." York didn't answer. He simply looked down, feeling out of place. He didn't fight for medals or headlines. He fought because it was what he had to do to survive and to protect the men beside him. In April 1919, York was summoned to receive the Medal of Honor, the highest award in the American military. The ceremony took place in a quiet courtyard in France. Generals lined up in spotless uniforms, medals gleaming in the sun. York arrived late, wearing a uniform that still carried the stains of mud and sweat, as if the war clung to him no matter how much he tried to wash it away. General Pershing, the commander of all American forces, stepped forward. "Corporal York, your actions stand among the greatest displays of battlefield bravery in the history of this nation." He pinned the medal on York's chest. York swallowed hard. He didn't feel proud. He felt humbled and haunted when reporters asked him how he managed such a feat. York answered simply, "I reckon God was guiding my hand." When York returned to the hills of Tennessee, the whole county turned out to greet him. Church bells rang, flags flew, children waved banners with his name. For the first time in his life, York saw the mountains he loved not as a place he escaped from, but as a place he had fought to come back to. But fame made him uncomfortable. People asked him to pose for photographs or tell the story again and again. York always downplayed it. "I ain't no better than any other soldier," he would say. "I just happened to be where the Lord needed me." But even he couldn't deny the impact. His story spread across America, inspiring thousands. People called him the greatest civilian soldier of the war. Others called him the man who saved his entire battalion. York called himself a Christian first, and a soldier only when I had to be. York spent the rest of his days quietly. He returned to farming, teaching, and helping poor children in the mountains. He refused to profit from his wartime fame, turning down offers from Hollywood, newspapers, and publishers. When people asked why he had been so brave, York would always give the same answer: "I just tried to live the way the Lord showed me." But deep inside, he knew the truth was more complicated. He had been forced to make a choice between his faith and his duty. And in the chaos of war, he had chosen both. He fought with a rifle in his hands, but with prayer in his heart. The world would remember him as a hero. York remembered himself as a man who did what needed to be done. Years later, when York was old and gray, a young reporter visited him. "Mr. York," the reporter asked, "do you consider yourself the greatest American hero of the Great War?" York chuckled softly, leaning back in his wooden chair. "No, son. The real heroes are the boys who didn't come back home." He gazed out at the hills, those peaceful, rolling mountains that had shaped his soul. "I just want folks to remember one thing," he said. "A man don't have to hate to fight. Sometimes he just has to love something enough to protect it." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying his words softly across the valley. York closed his eyes. He had fought for peace, not war, for life, not death, for the men beside him, and for the home he cherished. And that was the legacy he left behind: a reluctant soldier, a humble hero, a man who shouldn't have fought, but when he did, changed the course of history. Years passed, and the world changed around Alvin York. But the quiet valley of Pall Mall remained much the same: green ridges, whispering pines, and the slow rhythm of country life. York aged, but he did so with dignity, carrying himself with the same modest strength that had defined him since the beginning. His farm grew peaceful again. Children played in the fields he once plowed as a boy. Students walked the roads to the York Institute, the school he fought so hard to build, the proof that courage could create life, not just save it. Visitors came from across the nation to see him. Some were veterans, others were students, others simply admirers who wanted to shake the hand of the man who did not want to kill but did so to protect his brothers. York greeted them all with the same soft-spoken humility. When asked about the war, he always said the same thing: "I did what I had to do, but I pray none of you ever have to." In time, his health weakened. The years of hardship, poverty, and the strain of responsibility took their toll. But even as his body faltered, his spirit remained unbroken. He spent his last years on his porch, watching the sun fall behind the hills, grateful for the quiet life God had given him, the life he once feared he would never return to. When Alvin York passed away on September 2, 1964, the news swept across the nation. Newspapers called him America's greatest hero, the reluctant warrior, the man who should not have been a soldier, but became the greatest of them all. Yet in the little valley where he was born, his legacy was simpler and far more true to them. He was Alvin, the neighbor who helped mend fences, the man who prayed louder than he talked, the father who worked tirelessly for the school his children attended, the friend who never forgot where he came from, on the hillside where he was laid to rest. The wind whispered through the trees, the same wind that once carried his prayers into the night as a troubled young man. Unsure of his place in the world, now the world knew. He had shown that courage could grow from doubt, that faith could guide a trembling hand, that a simple man with a steady heart could change the course of history. Generations later, people still tell his story. They tell it not because he killed, but because he lived, with humility, conviction, and a belief that even the smallest voice can echo across time. Alvin York's rifle is silent now, but the lesson he left behind will never fade. Greatness is not found in glory, but in doing what is right, even when the whole world is watching. ****